my absolute pleasure to welcome Nwabisa from the Branson Center of Entrepreneurship. She really needs no introduction, but I'm going to allow her to introduce herself because every time she and I are together, we have wonderful conversations. And I thought, why don't we just record one of these conversations? So today, that's what we're going to do. We're just going to record our conversation like you all are flies on the wall, and we'll see what magic comes out of the next 40 minutes. Hopefully there will be some, but I know there always is every time Nwabisa opens her mouth. So Nwabisa, please tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at the Branson Center.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast, and I guess for daring to record one of the conversations that we have over time. It's always my pleasure to also be in conversation with you. And so, where to start? I describe myself as a connector, first and foremost. And to have got to that point of describing myself as a connector, I think it's also part of a personal journey of having to trying to figure out and articulate what my purpose is. And so my purpose is to connect people to each other and to opportunities. And whilst it's so easy to talk about having reached this place of being able to articulate my purpose, and it sounds so smooth, it's a messy journey to get to the point of understanding why do I do what I do. And some of that understanding sometimes even comes from going through to some of the little scars and the knocks that you've taken through life. And so, part of also describing who I am is I'm an only child, brought up by a single parent. And so the ghost of loneliness is something that stalks quite closely. And so I think maybe in trying to heal my fear of being alone and being lonely, I sought out to always be that person who connects with other people and connects people to each other. And therefore my purpose is this delightful optimism and inspiring thing that invokes something in me. It also is part of my journey of understanding what is it that I'm afraid of and what is it that I don't want to experience in life. And so perhaps then I also then managed to then reach this incredibly lucky moment where the confluence of what is my purpose along with what is my fears plus the skills that I have came along and was then also crafted into a job, and therefore I get paid to also live out my purpose. And so today I serve as the Strategic Partnerships Director at the Branson Center. The Branson Center is a venture studio where we believe that ventures and entrepreneur-led innovation is critical to solving to some of the world's most wicked problems: climate crisis, energy crisis, food security crises. And so my role specifically in the Branson Center is to make sure that it is the most collaborative enabler of entrepreneurship in South Africa, in the global South, and hopefully around the world, so that the Branson Center can do its work of building ventures that matter and investing in ventures that matter. And whilst we do that, hopefully we can have a lot of fun.
Yeah. Tell me, I mean, there's so many threads I already want to pull, but maybe tell me why you think building ventures matters.
So I think whenever we want to build the societies that we want to be a part of, and for me, society, of course, is sort of almost like a very sociological term, but actually let's talk about when we want to build communities that we want to be a part of. It's important that we have the people who are the makers, the builders, the dreamers, the visionaries. And every now and again, you're going to need this other lot of people who are the misfits at times, the people who are ready to think out of the box, who are happy to reinvent themselves from time to time, who are happy to take certain risks, and they even sometimes have that almost sociopathic tendency of saying, I'm going to solve for this problem that I see, and I know that it's going to be so valuable that a whole bunch of other people are going to pay me for having solved this problem that I see in the world in which I live in. And therefore, those are the people who actually are quite ready to start ventures. They're the risk takers, the dreamers, the visionaries, the people who are ready to always think out of the box and then move fast. And so for me, building ventures is important because it means venture-led and entrepreneur-led solutions will also play a role in making sure that we live in a world and in communities that have, sustainable planetary health, people who are thriving and are happy, and at the same time, inclusive economies that then are generative. So ventures for me are an important part of building and seeing the world that I want to see.
And why, I know you and I have talked about this a lot in the past, but why do you think it matters that a diverse group of people get to build the world?
Sure, I think it's remiss not to take in our sense of place. So you and I so happen today to be talking to each other in separate rooms, but we are in Cape Town, South Africa. And the South African story is such a harsh and stark manifestation of inequality, whether it's unequal access to income generation opportunities, unequal access to quality education, unequal access to certain rights, even social needs. And so it's important that if we are clear that we are no longer interested in living in a world that is this unequal, it's important that we have different voices in the room whenever we're building ventures or trying to actually figure out how can we get something like the economy to be a lot more inclusive than it is today. How can we get economic opportunity to be inclusive? So before we even think about accessing the thing, how do we even get equal access to the opportunity to exist? And so we can't do that if we keep on being in the room with people who look like us, sound like us, have the same worldview as us, because that means our worldview, of course, will be brought forward. But what about other worldviews? We need the diversity to be in the room to actually see the inclusivity. But also, I think it's just a lot more interesting to have a whole bunch of people who every now and again are even brushing up against each other. And every now and again, there's even that existence of what I like to call the exquisite tension, because it's in that tension, questions are being asked, growth is almost being forced out of it. And hopefully opportunities are then being squeezed out of these cracks and the tensions and the gaps that exist. We've got to have a lot more different people in the room whenever we're talking about building something.
I think Mandela coined such a beautiful phrase when he talked about South Africa as the rainbow nation. And of course, rainbows are beautiful phenomenons that we only get to see, of course, because of rain, because of the storm. But then the sun comes out and creates this beautiful masterpiece that, I don't know. I mean, can you imagining a rainbow? I mean, it's just extraordinary, isn't it? But that's the exquisite beauty of something natural, and the beauty of sort of differing forces coming together and creating something with so much color and so much life. And that for me is such a beautiful reflection of diversity.
Yes.
And that sense of that where there is the possibility of making something beautiful, exquisite, even as you said, when all the colors are being expressed in their place and having opportunity to be themselves.
And some of it then even becomes then this delightful surprise, right? When you're still so caught up in the experience of a rainy day, and when sometimes you look up and there's just the sun hits everything right and that rainbow shows itself, is actually when you bring in the diversity, you actually lose some form of control of what's going on in the room, but then you allow for this beautiful and delightful surprise to come through that is even better than what you would have designed or imagined.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It's something better than we could have ever imagined, because of having more voices being heard, more faces being seen, more expressions being realized. And I think it's very easy to think about diversity in terms of just pure economics. And sometimes we miss the beauty, actually, that diversity is, and the wealth of insight there is to be gained, and the discomfort, obviously, also from engaging and seeing many voices being heard and expressions being created. I know in my own work with female entrepreneurs here, seeing problems getting solved that, you almost know that problem was designed to be solved by that type of person, or this person coming from this background, with this experience, with this worldview, and it couldn't be solved by anyone else coming out from a different perspective. And so that's what my own heart says, that if there's not a diverse group of people at the table solving some of our biggest world problems, there's a whole load of problems that will never get solved. And that's why we need diversity, and that's why we need lots of people at the table.
I agree.
And this is why we like each other, of course. You said something fascinating when you opened, which was the work I do now is largely about building and connecting community and bringing people together, but also has come for you out of a place of realizing your own desires and your own passions and your own wounds even. And I think I see very often entrepreneurs solving problems because of a wound or a challenge that they're aware of, or a problem that they could see. It's almost like our own pain becomes a point of, potential point of healing if you let it. So let's pull that thread a little bit and see where that goes.
Yeah, I think, as a comment, it's one of those things more and more as I perhaps become more confident in my skill set, become more confident as a human. It's understanding that trying to cleave away parts of myself away from what I'm doing as I present myself in different parts of the day. So if I've woken up and I've already had a bad night because maybe I didn't sleep well, me thinking that I'm going to have a good day at work when I've already had a bad night that's led to a clumsy morning, and then being very surprised when I don't have a good day at work, is a very strange approach to the day. Whereas if I can then actually accept and say, right, I've had a bad day, or bad night, I've got a clumsy morning, which means that by the time I meet the team, it's okay when I walk into the team and kind of thunder into the room and go, guys, today is going to be a very strange day. I cannot walk away from already the experience I've had for the last few hours. And so I use that as such a maybe silly example, but the reality is that every time we try and then pull apart, ourselves away from our work selves or our purpose-led selves, that's when we start tripping up, and we're not sure why we're not fully realizing the magical potential that we have, or fully realizing our ability to then draw from the resources that we actually have around us. And so maybe to that point is, when you are very clear on the desire that you have, whether it's from a wound or from the problems that exist around you, or even from your hopes and ambitions, you can then be clearer in terms of how you articulate this to so many people around you, which means very quickly you start being in the process of creating a very interesting community around you that knows what you're about, what your needs are, what you're looking for, what excites you, what inspires you. And then people actually start working in and around you. And that then actually becomes you automatically starting to build your own community, where you don't need to walk into somebody who's going to build, be a community manager on your behalf, a community engagement manager on your behalf, because by simply being true to what you're about, both dark and light, I think you can actually start seeing what it looks like when we're for me, the fullest expression of humanity, which is all of us coming together to enable each other.
So I'm hearing you say there that there's this force that we can harness if we can embrace, I loved how you phrased it then, the dark and the light, because we've all got dark and light in us, pain and joy, happiness and sadness. It's kind of like two sides of one coin. And very often for entrepreneurs are addressing pain points, maybe that they've experienced themselves, or pain that they can see, or trying to solve for a pain maybe. And usually we're deeply connected to that pain, right? It's very rare that you find entrepreneurs who are not somehow, they don't have that, there's no story behind this pain, that this problem that they can see. There's usually sort of this deep sense of connectedness. I think what many people haven't necessarily put together, though, which you're just starting to lead us in this space, is this sense of how that connects you with others, and how that builds a world around you, because entrepreneurship's, the word I would use normally would be lonely.
It's lonely.
Isolated, that you feel strange, not connected, that you feel like you can see things that other people can't see. And what you're saying to us, though, is that actually there's a point of connection in there that we might not have discovered.
I think it's this idea of, perhaps because of the work that I do and I'm paid to do, it's so relational and driven that the only indicator of success I have is how many meaningful relationships exist around me and the Branson Center. It's actually not so much about how much money is coming in. All of that will follow, because that comes from the relationships. So I spend more time in these types of conversations with individuals, trying to understand what keeps you up at night, what gets you out of bed, what excites you, what absolutely frightens you, because it's in that, I guess, it's in creating that energy force field of talking and connecting that effectively we become informed, which means that I now can sit with Sarah's list of pain points, but also points of inspiration, top of mind when I'm having other conversations. Suddenly it's as simple as if somebody mentions something about enabling women entrepreneurs through, impactful financing. Suddenly the first person that comes to mind is Sarah, because I've spent time understanding what Sarah is about. And a lot of people will poo-poo this because they'll think it sounds quite time intensive. It sounds like you've got to be a certain type of person. Yes, like any sort of skill, you've got to have the inclination for it. So if you are a founder, I then implore you to find somebody who is skilled to be somebody who manages your partnerships, not your sales, not business development, but your partnerships, because that's the person who's going to start unlocking the relationships that when the time comes for the ask, when the time comes for, maybe to solve a crisis, those relationships will then come into play so much quicker than if you start a cold call. And so it is about creating connection first and foremost. And I think we've seen it, maybe some of it might have been the experience of being in lockdown, the interruptions in terms of so many things that we thought were normal and how we had to reimagine ourselves, reorganize ourselves, one. And then I think seeing this very rapid change in the world that's happening because of pushes in technology, even rearrangements of geopolitical sort of relationships. And so actually, the thing that is most common in everything that happens in our lives, or the thing that's most enduring, is our relationships. How you and I talk, 3 years ago, we would have tried to meet and do this conversation in a studio, in the same room, in the same town. I'm assuming you've probably had more of these conversations online through the various meeting platforms. And we've normalized that. In 2 years' time, it probably will be some sort of bot speaking on our behalf. Not even 2 years' time, maybe in 6 months.
Hopefully not.
I don't know, And so, but what will always be enduring is the relationships that we would have nurtured and the community that we would have built amongst and for ourselves.
And I think entrepreneurs very often undervalue the importance of relationships and the importance of who you know, not necessarily what you know, being such a key for unlocking so many things. And I think what we're talking about here is also different than networking, different than being networked. So maybe let's explain, because if it takes a village to raise a child, as the proverb goes, it certainly takes a village, a city, a nation to build a business, right? It takes enormous amount of people to grow and scale a business. So what's the difference between being well networked and being in relationship with people?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because a lot of times people will turn around and say, well, you're a fantastic networker and I'm a terrible networker. And first of all, I abhor the word network. So I try very hard not to talk about networking. I try very hard not to host networking events, because that's not what we're talking about here. going back in terms of the things that entrepreneurs sometimes also underplay. So entrepreneurs will often underplay the value of having the right people around them, and really the aim of the game being it's about who you know, as you mentioned. The second thing that most human beings undervalue, but particularly women, is what they bring into any conversation. We immediately go into a lot of conversations, hence why networking feels so difficult, is we go into it with this idea of, I'm here to learn from whoever I meet. I have nothing to bring in the room. Whoever I meet is going to help me. That's what I need. I just need help. The thing about relationship building is that there's something about where you need to be okay with understanding, what do you bring into the conversation? What value do you bring? Because I kid you not, 100% of every single human being on this planet has value to bring into the conversation. And so it's on you. And so there's almost a responsibility that even when you walk into a conversation, be clear on what kind of value you can bring, so that whilst you are in conversation with Sarah, in engagement with Sarah, you can offer something, even if it's another connection or a point of, advice or a comment, but you bring value. So be clear in terms of what you bring in. The value of relationship then is also, it's an open channel of communication. You're not here to win. No one's here to conquer the next one. It's this idea of, I want to learn more about you. I'm insatiably curious about you. And because I'm so curious about you, I'm probably going to eventually get you to a point where you're motivated and compelled to share so much about you that what I learn about you will help me understand how I can be valuable to you. And equally, I feel safe enough to share about myself, and you can understand how you can be of value to me. The third piece is that because we're not here to conquer, there is no full time, in terms of there's no end of the match, which means that perhaps in our first encounter, in our second encounter, we may not know where we're going in this conversation. But as we're learning more and more about each other, and we're starting to learn about purpose, our objectives, we'll eventually find that point of intersection, because we're starting to understand that our values are aligned. And therefore, chances are we will work together. May not be in the way that we might imagine, but we will eventually start enabling each other. For me, the scorecard of how a relationship is going is when somebody in your relationship ecosystem or in your community is able to bring you into the room without you being in the room. In other words, because I've now understood so much about Sarah, and I've been curious about Sarah, and Sarah's been curious about me, if I hear a conversation that I think Sarah should know about, I will advocate for Sarah, I will champion for Sarah, I will bring Sarah into the room without her knowing that I even brought her into the room. And that for me is then the true power of relationship building and building a community where people are able to champion your cause without you being there.
Yeah, so it's like having advocates.
Absolutely.
For you that are able to sort of work on your behalf wherever they are.
And it's super efficient, right? Eventually, if we're trying to then be, if you're trying to use some of the other more binary language around these things, it's impossible for a founder, for anyone else to be everywhere all the time. But what is fantastic is if you've got this great network, there goes the word, but if you've got this great, community around you, you will actually be in the room that you need to be all the time.
Yeah, that's such a powerful thought. We've got to hashtag that. You will be in the room that you've got to be all the time. I mean, that's an amazing thought, isn't it? And just out of this seed of an idea that community matters, having relationships that matters. And I often think it's easy to get stuck with relationships that are easy, or where we've got lots of obvious things in common, or big points of connection. Becomes slightly more challenging. And I do think it's challenging for women anyway, as you said. But it's like crossing over sort of this divide of finding points of connection, finding ways to connect it in a way that matters. What advice would you give about that?
Well, I think it's the idea of, let's go back to even some of those words, the word relationship, the word partner, and how we understand them. So even if you're thinking of a romantic relationship, it's very unlikely that you'll enter into a romantic relationship without consent from both parties. Some sort of discussion needs to happen to understand that we're now in a relationship. And I'm sure a lot of people giggle because a lot of us have been in situations, but I'm talking relationships. And so it applies then in your professional life, in your life as a founder who's building a business, is that you've got to get to a point where you're clear that there is a relationship here. So on some level, it's almost be demanding in a way where the other party is clear that Nwabisa is in this room because she understands that together we can enable each other and we can enable common objectives. And so let's start articulating perhaps even the so-called rules of engagement. So something as simple as maybe you meet somebody and you really like what they're about in terms of their work, and you can see how their work could maybe, line up with what you're doing in your business. Well, ask for a call, ask for that walk, ask for that meal. And as that's happening, ask for how can we stay in touch in a way that's meaningful. My trick, and I actually even put in timelines where I say to somebody, I really enjoyed talking to you. Would you mind if once a quarter we got on a call? And I'll put it in our diaries so that we can keep the momentum of staying in touch. And so what happens is that either then you start having those calls on a quarterly basis, or when your diary reminds you that it's time for you to have your quarterly call and you can't get onto it, at least the ping of your diary has maybe taken that person and brought them higher up in terms of your prioritization for the next couple of weeks. And you're thinking about them, and suddenly a lot of what you're thinking about is channeling things their way. So there's this idea of be clear in the communication, be clear in the expectations of how do we keep this relationship going. The third part is be as generous as you can in terms of knowing what you bring into the room. So oftentimes, and I think as women, we've experienced so much scarcity in terms of access to contacts, access to resources, that sometimes we fall into the complex of thinking that if I introduce this person to Sarah, Sarah might not then want to talk to me again, or they'll get dazzled by this person and then I won't have access to Sarah like that ever again. That's not how humans work. Sarah is actually going to be so excited that you've brought another interesting person into her, ecosystem, that she probably will come back to you and say, thank you so much for that contact. Actually, tell me again, how did you meet? And then there's another layer to how you know each other. And there's now yet another leg that connects you to this relationship. And so you've added complexity to it, which makes it harder to walk away from on some levels. So, be generous in terms of that. Give people your time, be available, be accessible in that way. You don't have to be loud. So it's also, I'm not advocating for people to now go on a social media blitz. Choose who you are and be true to who you are. I think that's important. And then because you're in a relationship and in partnership, effectively what happens as well is that you're not sitting in a very legalistic relationship that there is the risk of breach, meaning that if I don't fulfill certain criteria, and if I don't meet certain deliverables, Sarah and I will never talk to each other because we're now in breach of contract. But rather, because we're in a relationship and we're talking to each other, we'll be able to also articulate when things are difficult. We'll be able to articulate when I need time out or when I'm no longer available. We can also be okay if I disappear from you for the next 18 months and I pop back up and we pick up from where we left off. We can also be okay if maybe the next time I contact you, I'm asking you for something as opposed to going into a deep and meaningful conversation about where you're at in your life, because we've already established that connection. And so those are sort of my handy hints and my handy tips around that. And you don't have to be everywhere all the time. It's also so wonderful to get to a point where you can start being discerning around what rooms you want to be in, going back to this idea of rooms, and perhaps helping a lot of women founders around the inclination to go to every single networking event. That you don't have to do that. Perhaps what you can do is identify people where you already have a meaningful relationship with and understand what kind of person are there in your community? So you have the foghorns. I'm a foghorn. I will make a noise about anyone all the time. If I like you and like what you're about, I'm your big foghorn. You'll then have the cheerleader, somebody who will always be there to encourage you, show you the sunny side of life. You'll also have sort of the realist, who will tell you that, my friend, this is not it, and will help you kind of see when you maybe are in situations and relationships in terms of that are not enabling for what you're trying to build. And then you have people who are just here ready to do whatever you ask them to do. They're your bystanders. So they're here. If you're telling them to buy something, they'll buy that thing. If you're asking them to like a thing, they'll like that thing. They're equally valuable, because these, it's effectively your advocates, your champions, your influencers, and your bystanders. And if every now and again you can do the exercise of looking at just your phone book, never mind looking at anything else, just scrolling through the names in your contact list and being able to identify, who's my big foghorn here? Who's my big influence? And how can I have those conversations and inform them in a way in which they will actually continue to do the thing that they're really good at? Suddenly your community will grow through those people as well. Thank those people too.
Yeah, that's genius advice there, with like trying to understand who around you is good at what, and who could help you in different ways. I know there are so many people in my life that very often say, Sarah, you've got to meet this person. And then they just introduce us over email. And I have made it a habit of mine to always say yes to spending time with someone who has introduced me to someone else. And sometimes you've got no idea what the conversation is going to be about, and no idea really even why they want to introduce you to them, other than they think it's a good idea.
Yes.
And it's trusting your people, isn't it? It's recognizing, oh, this person's my cheerleader, or this person's my foghorn, and they've been talking about me, and now they want to open doors for me with X, Y, and Z person. And now the opportunity is mine to build a new relationship and start from scratch, but knowing that someone else has said a relationship with this person's a great idea. Get to know them.
And sometimes, every now and again, sometimes those intros are absolutely rubbish. You come out of it and you think, I don't know what that was about. But it's okay to keep that connection for some time, because whoever introduced you
there would be something there. Yes.
Something. So it's on you again to be curious enough to scratch around to find out what that something is. Or it's on you to go back to the person who introduced you to understand, what did they see? And so you can then also reflect on, hold on, what am I also portraying to the world? Maybe the reason some of these introductions are starting to feel quite rubbish for me is because maybe I'm no longer communicating, articulating what I'm about accurately. And therefore that in itself becomes a reflection exercise.
Well, it becomes a reflection of who you're being introduced to also. So that's also interesting, isn't it? I don't know about you though, but 9 times out of 10, maybe 9.5 times out of 10, I find that the conversations of the people that I'm introduced to are fascinating.
They're brilliant.
We may have, I mean, that's the thing, we have to lose an outcome mentality, right? We may not come away with a 5-point plan of how we're both going to now conquer the world with each other. There may be no actionable outcomes at all. I was speaking for the woman I had been introduced to maybe a month ago, and she said, I don't know how this really works. Do you? And I said, yes, we just chat and we get to know each other. And we get to understand the things that you care about and the things that I care about, and we see if we can help each other. I mean, that's it.
That is all.
But there doesn't have to, that's the interesting thing. There doesn't have to be an outcome there and then. But you're right, having this sense of relationship that, when something triggers that person, you are their advocate when you are in that room, that applies to them and this is for them. And same for you. If you've shared well enough what you care about, what your pain points are, what your struggles are, what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, and that you've shared more than, I don't know, it's like not just a superficial sharing. It's kind of an authentic sharing of like, this is what I'm struggling with at the moment. I find that line alone an amazing opener for taking a conversation to a whole nother level, because the moment you are vulnerable enough to say, this is what I am struggling with at the moment, you've given the person who you're talking to permission to help you.
Absolutely.
Or join you in the trenches. I commiserate with you.
Totally. And also in that, back to this idea of it doesn't always have to have, this outcome. And also it's crazy to think that you're going to have a 30-minute virtual coffee with someone or 1 hour in person with someone for the first time, and you're going to come out with a plan. That's actually sometimes a little bit scary if that's happened. That's usually maybe one of you or both of you is in the manic phase of life. And so, be careful, but that's okay. The second, the piece that for me becomes really exciting is when one of two things happen. So you meet this brand new person, and then very quickly, because maybe of just the lens through which you're now looking at the world because of that encounter, either you'll meet that person again very quickly, but now it wasn't planned, whether now it is at a social gathering or at another sort of event or gathering. And suddenly there's no greater joy than running into somebody and kind of being like, we can now hug. Or now you can be my friend at this event, and now we're going to walk through this room together, and suddenly you're this little, duo, which then brings in some joy, some fun, and sometimes some security if we're maybe a little bit nervous about going to another space by yourself. I find that happens quite often. The other thing that then happens is suddenly, because the both of you are starting to talk about each other in your various and respective other communities, your communities start drawing closer, and suddenly somebody will bring you up and say, Sarah, your name came up in this space. I didn't know that you knew so-and-so. Oh my goodness. And then that adds another layer, and maybe might even change a conversation that you were having with someone, because now there's almost been this validation that their other person knows you, and therefore that changes this other conversation. So it's like this incredibly, for me, generative and self-fulfilling and self-sustaining way of looking at life, is that one relationship becomes another, becomes many, becomes a community. Communities joining together becomes a movement.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we know that the boys' club have known this information for a very long time. The business world has been revolving around what we're talking about today for decades and decades, hundreds of years, right? This is how industry was born, on the backs of somebody knowing someone else and helping someone else and helping him get capital because he's interested in that, and making a connection and doing a deal, and something's getting done, and things are happening because of relationships. And I think women particularly haven't understood this is partly the way the world works, and we've been coming at this approach of doing business as if our experience, our achievements, and our skill sets are going to enable us to get where we want to go, as opposed to realizing all those things are fantastic, but actually, yes, having a wide network of people around you that you are connected with and known, and people know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that you are moving in all sorts of circles, will help you make things happen. And I find myself frequently shocked. That's probably my own naivety, but shocked by whenever I hear the boys' club expressing things that is so normal for the boys' club. And I find myself shocked because I'm thinking, gosh, I so don't think like that. I don't think all this works like this. But it does. And we have to become, I don't know, comfortable with the idea of this this whole thing that we're talking about, which is not very pin downable, but this whole concept of community, this whole concept of building your networks, being in relationship with other people, is so critical to you being able to make things happen in the world.
Well, I mean, you want to get to, I mean, my friends and I joke about, you want to get to a point where you know that early on a Saturday morning, when you wake up and you're going through your phone has the ability to run a small country.
Love that. Who's in my contact should have the ability to run maybe a big country, not a small country either, a big country.
I just don't like the complexity of lots of people, but I think just, a small country, just because that's my choice.
Love
so
it.
being able to think in that way is really important, because you've already gone as far as being a founder. You've gone as far as somebody who is positioning themselves to create livelihoods for other people, to solve real life problems for other people, to be a net creator of wealth for yourself, but also for the people that are around your business. So you've already gone pretty far in terms of your thinking, in terms of understanding the power that you have in you and the power and the influence that you can have. So to be able to think just the next step, that now, how do I find equally ambitious people and be quite okay that we're in a circle of ambition, we're in a circle of change making, and how do we make sure that we're in circles that then continue to enable? And so, yes, the Boys Club have managed to get golf just right. The fact that so much is happening on the golf course, and half of us are sitting in boardrooms and we have no idea of what the conversations are going on and what's happening. Also knowing fully that whatever we've discussed is but the tip of the iceberg. The rest of that conversation is going to happen very far away from us. So I think we need to be able to figure out how to replicate some of that. We also need to understand how to be integrated in some of even the boys' clubs as well. So I'm not necessarily completely promoting this exclusionary sort of dynamic. So yes, our own women clubs, but also being able to go to the golf course and be able to play with the boys and talk with the boys and be okay with that. And then the third thing, which I'm equally curious about, is when we're also in our own circles as women, what are also the things that we're okay to identify and say, we don't want to repeat what happens in the boys' club? What can we do to actually improve on it because of how we are, how we're wired, how we see the world? How can we also create enabling circles that allow for women to be women, however you define that, how we can bring in the feminine in whatever we do, regardless of how you identify. And thirdly, to use that then as the evolution even of the existing boys' club, so that we're also not going to necessarily use our circles to perpetuate the very injustices that exist in this world, the very inequalities that we started this conversation with. And so there's almost like a looseness and a liberation to think about how can we do this differently and in a way that's enabling.
Yeah, I love the idea of doing this without huge egos having to be thrown around the room. And this whole idea of having to one-up each other. I love this idea of being able to stand alongside each other without being threatened by each other, which, again, comes back to scarcity, right? We don't have to be threatened if we're not afraid of there not being enough.
Yes.
If there's not space for me, or there's not enough money for me, or there's only one job for me, then we're threatened by each other, right? Because we're in direct competition with each other. But if we eliminate the threat of competition and we say there's more than enough money in the world, there's more enough money for you to raise money, for me to raise money, for you to be successful, me to be successful, you to be CEO, me to be CEO. There's no shortage of space for us to inhabit and own and possess and champion.
And there's also, and also this idea of part of that abundance mindset is there's more than enough in terms of resources, but there's also there is acceptance, abundant acceptance of your ideas are valid. They may not maybe be valid to this person here, doesn't mean you dump the idea. You keep moving until you start understanding that your ideas, your thoughts are valid. I had this example, very, very, again, silly example, but I think it illustrates. A friend of mine was talking about how she's in a large organization, large international organization in a large global city in Europe. And she's from South Africa, and she'd applied for a new position within her organization. And then that position got frozen, and therefore she didn't get the position. And she was just saying it had been quite a taxing sort of journey, because she'd had to run through so many interviews whilst doing her job in this organization. And I said, well, wouldn't it be cool if, because of the level of mastery that you have, and I know how skilled she is in her role and what a brilliant addition she'd be in any team, I said, wouldn't it be cool if you'd reached a point where you were no longer applying for the roles in your organization? Because if your organization sees how valuable you are, and you maybe are communicating that value, but they need to see it, they would pluck you from the one position and enable you into the next position that then is also curated and described in a way that you're set up for success, and therefore you can then bring massive value into the organization and you can be happy. I think there are certain places in terms of where we're at in our mastery, we no longer need to compete and we no longer need to prove, but rather we're there to collaborate, exchange, curate, redesign, reimagine, and enable abundance, joy, fruitfulness, but enable change, the positive change we want to see.
Well, that's also back to this idea of understanding your own value, understanding the value that you bring to running a small country, right? It's understanding, this is where I'm most gifted. This is my thing. This is where I'm the expert. This is where I'm growing and learning, but this is my space that I inhabit. And this space consumes me, and I know it really well. And there's something very powerful about that, which is very different than having a huge ego, right?
Yeah.
Very different than throwing it about there that you are this thing. It's about just an inner confidence that is content with understanding, I know who I am. I know who I'm good at. And everybody would be lucky to have me, because this is just what I do. And I do it with joy and delight, without anything to prove anymore, because I already know.
And it then also liberates you from the things that you don't know, and the things that you don't know that you don't know. And so you're not walking around so scared that one day you'll be found out, because actually you've been able to articulate that this is what I'm really good at. This is why I founded this business. This is why I do what I do. And because that is why I do what I do, there's this whole bunch of other stuff that I have no business knowing.
I don't do. And I get other people to do.
And I get other people to do it, and other people who enjoy doing it. So you're not tricking me and finding out that actually, you know, I'm so terrible on Excel. I told you, I'm all about the relationships. There is no ways that I'm sitting with spreadsheets all day long. And therefore, whenever it's time to do spreadsheets, there's somebody else who gets very delighted by the idea of doing spreadsheets. And so you enable them to do the best spreadsheets of their lives, and you continue to do what you do. So no one is exposing me when they send me an Excel spreadsheet and I mess it up. I'm like, I told you I didn't know it. And it's okay.
I told you, it's not my thing. Yeah, and I think that's hard for many entrepreneurs, is recognizing you don't have to be the expert at everything. You just have to be the expert at getting the experts into the room, right? At surrounding yourself with experts, surrounding yourself with people, and in all sorts of ways. You have all sorts of gifts and talents, and that you don't have to have all the talents in the universe. You just have to be great at assembling people who have all the talents in the universe, and recognizing your talent is, what your great gift to the world is, and using that and leveraging it.
And there's that power of diversity again, which is when, you know, diversity means you're bringing in all kinds of skills and talents into the room, and therefore you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. And so diversity is also freeing, actually.
Yeah. a coach recently just said to me, who's going to be the chief worrier for that thing? And I loved this idea of hiring a chief worrier. Because so much about being an entrepreneurship, we worry about so many things. Right? There are so many fires you're often putting out, and so many struggles, and so many things that keep you awake at night. And this idea of bringing other people in to the table to worry about things for you, to have the to be the responsible person that worries about a particular drama, or there being enough cash in the bank, or whatever the worry is. And it's like, wow, we can even surround ourselves with people to worry for us.
We can all worry together, and you can worry for me. I like that. I need more.
I like to do, and it put a whole, I don't know about, but it put a whole different spin for me around this idea of building teams. Because then you're building a team around you, you're surrounding yourself with your inner community, if you like. We've been talking largely about outer communities, but we're now talking about sort of this inner community that lives and breathes and sleeps, with you around the thing that you're trying to do. And they start to carry some of the weight of the world that you carry.
Totally.
And care about a specific thing in a specific way so that you don't have to. I love that.
I'm going to now be talking about chief warriors for the next
Chief warriors.
Mm-hmm.
Chief warriors / chief warriors. Warriors and warriors. Same
exactly.
thing.
Absolutely. No, I'm going to be talking about this for the next 2 weeks. You'll hear me in another podcast talking about it.
I think it's such a genius idea that I wish I could take credit for it. It's not my idea, but it's fabulous. And I just, it comes back to this same principle of we just have to surround ourselves. We aren't islands. We aren't, building enterprises, building countries. We can't be an island. We need diversity. We need each other. We need community in all sorts of shapes and forms. It's absolutely critical for growth and development.
Totally. And I think every now and again, we also remove this idea of community and we maybe call it networking, and we make it this big thing that sits apart from who we are. Yes. Meanwhile, it's what we've been doing since, since we were children, where we've been trying to make friends, trying to get friends to do things with us, for us, against us, whatever. But it's things that we do all the time. Hence, even, the one of the more odious ways to punish a human being is to put them in solitary confinement. That should already tell you about how essential being surrounded by other people is to our existence. So I'm sometimes curious to find out how and when we made this idea of being in community such a different thing that we almost now need to be workshopped around it, when it's something that we do so easily. When you think about your grandmother sharing a recipe with her friend, or telling her other friend that my friend makes the best scones or whatever, that's advocating for her friend, that's positioning her friend as chief scone maker or whatever. So we've been doing it. We just somehow got caught up.
We translate it, don't we, into this world. We just haven't translated it well enough into ways that make sense to us. And I think we're starting to. It's just the dialogue and the language around it we need to become more familiar with. Yeah.
And I think especially perhaps through an African lens, through a lens of sometimes where so much of how we're now codifying what it looks like to be a successful entrepreneur is still, the points of reference are sort of white male people who come from the United States, so maybe are sitting in the tech industry, that they look so different and everything is so different from our everyday that we then think, well, everything we're doing must be wrong because it doesn't look like what the guys are doing. Exactly. And then you add language issues and suddenly people then completely get shattered in terms of their confidence to be able to go out there and communicate and build community and sustain communities, because now they're saying, I'm not doing it like the Oaks, the bros in Silicon Valley. So I'm hoping that we can start reclaiming some of our understanding of this is how we do it, because this is how it works here. And because we do it like this, I can also take it into Silicon Valley if I need to. And I will make sure that you understand me, because I'm human as well.
Yeah, 100%. Nwabisa, it has been so wonderful, as always, talking. Maybe leave us with a final piece of advice or final word of wisdom, maybe to sum up our conversation, if you can, into 1 or 2 sentences. That's a tough ask for sure. Or maybe the most important thing that has struck you today. But leave us with a final thought.
I think, you've met me, so I definitely don't know how to do things in 1 sentence. So
Okay, you can have 2.
Let's see where this goes. I think for me, the overarching thought that I have whenever I know that founders are listening to the conversation and founders are sitting in a very lonely journey and a very serious journey and a journey that is so wrapped up in who they are and who they want to be, is that every now and again is to remember to seek joy in what you do. Seek joy, not as a consequence of what you do, but seek joy as a tactic in terms of how you go through what you're doing. Have fun, have a sense of humor so that you can laugh at yourself from time to time and laugh at the things that are happening around you, because there's no more absurd journey than being a founder in the world. And so bringing in that lightness every now and again will help you sleep at night, will preserve your blood pressure readings, and will also maybe make you a little bit more tolerable in terms of your long-suffering friends and family who are around you. So joy and fun and lightness are welcome.
I love it. That is a great note for us to conclude on. Well, and this has been an absolute joy for me. So thank you so much for making this happen, Nwabisa. It is always lovely to spend time with you. Thank you for allowing us to share this conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm looking forward to many more conversations, recorded and unrecorded.
Absolutely.